In today's biased news, Western companies prepare to carve up Ukraine, Israel does more genocide, and the billionaires are turned into a fine slurry. A recent London meeting at the two-day Ukraine Recovery Conference saw pledges of over $60 billion towards rebuilding Ukraine, as the result of a war directly encouraged and maintained by US and NATO geopolitical interests. The donors include the EU, US, UK, and nearly 500 companies from 42 countries. Rebuilding critical civilian and military infrastructure, which had not been maintained since the illegal dissolution of the USSR in the early 90s, could cost upwards of $400 billion according to the World Bank. The conference also held talks about Ukrainian integration with the EU, with statements on how Ukraine still isn't ready in light of a judiciary and economy in need of reform according to EU specifications. Likewise with the country's crippling corruption issues, something that's been plaguing Ukraine for nearly 3 decades. Incredibly telling, the European Commission president stated that, quote, "Such reforms would send a powerful message to investors that they will get the transparency, fairness, and functioning institutions they need to invest in Ukraine." No step in this process is done out of the goodness and love Western nations have for Ukraine. It's a process dictated by the Western ruling class aimed at maintaining an important geostrategic military outpost for their own benefit. American lend-lease to Britain during World War II was finally paid off in 2006, and the Ukrainian situation will be no different. One military expert commented, "It will become a serious shackle on Ukraine. Ukraine will have to pay both the principal and interest for the various weapons and equipment it is to receive from the US in the future. The US is a businessman. It won't do business that will bring losses to itself." In previous American adventures at rebuilding, such as in Iraq, those that benefited were either American defense contractors like Halliburton and Lockheed Martin, private security firms like Blackwater, oil and energy giants that got preferential contracts to Iraqi oil, and reconstruction firms like Bechtel and Fluor that received billions in contracts for rebuilding Iraq. There is no indication that this time will be any different, as Ukraine stands to owe its European and North American allies billions after the war, essentially holding it as a vassal state to serve their interests to the detriment of Ukrainian economic, geopolitical, and internal security conditions. In extremely unimportant news, the rich dudes and rich dude's kid in the submarine are dead. In a small mercy, they died instantly, and the whole knocking on the sub walls thing was sensationalist nonsense. The US military was aware of the implosion just hours after the sub lost contact, and declined to make that information public, meaning millions of dollars in rescue efforts were expended for no purpose. Indian Prime Minister Modi and US President Biden faced questions about alleged human rights abuses during a joint news conference at the White House. Biden regurgitated the tired response about the importance of democratic values and the common commitment to diversity, culture, and open debate. The leaders discussed the need for a strong partnership, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, in the face of China's growing influence. They pledged to enhance cooperation in trade, technology, climate action, defense, and other areas. Modi's visit was significant as it marked his first state visit to the US, and highlighted the Biden administration's recognition of India's geopolitical position. Some legislators and activists raised concerns about human rights violations, including some who called for a boycott of Modi's address to Congress. The leaders also announced India's procurement of US-made armed drones, solidifying a next-generation defense partnership, which was clearly the main reason for the event. The United Nations has placed Russia's military and allied armed groups on its, quote, "list of shame" over the killing and maiming of hundreds of children in the Ukraine war. Coincidentally, and surely due to an honest oversight, Israeli forces have been left off the list, despite intentionally murdering hundreds of Palestinian children in recent years. Speaking of Israel, hundreds of Israeli settlers have stormed Palestinian properties in the occupied West Bank, killing one man. The murderers say they were motivated by the previous killing of Israeli settlers. As always, when Israeli genocide sparks justified self-defense, the military occupation uses it as yet another excuse for their atrocities. Back to Russia, Wagner chief Prigozhin has accused the Russian defense minister and commander of lying to President Putin and the Russian public over the extent of war losses in Ukraine. Not exactly a hot take, as this is common practice in war, but it makes for good publicity. On Thursday, Turkey's central bank hiked its key rate for the first time since early 2021, in a reversal of Erdogan's previous policies. This marks the latest attempt to put a stop to runaway inflation. Hopefully soon, the Turkish people won't have to trade their car for a loaf of bread. And in positive news, the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany announced on Tuesday in a press release that Germany will pay out over $1.4 billion to Holocaust survivors in the coming year. This is a reassuring gesture in a time when right-wing sentiment and xenophobic rhetoric is once again on the rise in Germany. That's all for today. We'll be back on Monday with more news. If you'd like to see episodes with more in-depth analysis, consider supporting the show on Patreon so we can grow and expand.